Hale, I wanted to have a kind of casual chat at this moment about something I alluded to back in my de-influencing video, and something that has been kind of marinating, as my beloved acting one professor, Miss Dwandra, would say, for a couple years. And that is the idea that publishing as an industry is one that tries to kind of force consumers or readers into what it wants them to do, rather than kind of organically responding to what it is seeing from readers. Honestly, with them kind of jumping on TikTok in even the limited kind of way that they have, is probably some of the fastest we've seen them respond to trends in recent years. And I'm not even talking about trends and trend cycles necessarily, because we do see kind of publishing trends happen in terms of the kind of books that are published, and that is cyclical and has been around for a long time. I remember having conversations with my library director when I was a library assistant in high school and college about how certain kinds of genres kind of cycle in and out of popularity. For instance, at the time, I was very interested in when we would be getting more time travel fiction. But this kind of thought process has been further exacerbated the last couple of weeks based on particularly the books I've gotten from the library, especially Venko and The Last Tale of the Flower Bride, which has nothing to do with the books themselves and everything to do with the price on the book. So this is $30 hardcover if I had bought it out of pocket and not from the library. And as I mentioned in the de-influencing video as well, I am currently in kind of a transition period where I am facing a layoff from my last employer and I'm looking for a new job. So spending $30 on a book really isn't in my budget right now. And we've been seeing this creep up in prices for a while. And I know that this is based on materials, this is based on supply and demand, this is based on a lot of supply chain issues that we've been seeing kind of these lingering repercussions of. So I get that there are kind of larger systems at play that are forcing this kind of price creep. And of course, there is the kind of unavoidable conversation of inflation, especially as we are kind of teetering on the edge of a recession at this point. And honestly, we're probably in one, but I'm no economist. So why is this kind of the impetus of a lot of this conversation for me? Because it goes back to the idea of hardcovers, period. And particularly the fact in the US, we have this kind of hardcover first model that I don't really think is serving us anymore. And I say this as someone who considers themselves a hardcover reader, but I think part of that is based on the system as it has been set up and responding to the system as it has been set up, because I really like to read new releases and be current and up to date on what's new and exciting. And so because things are released new in hardcover first, that is where you are going to interact with new titles. But I don't think that this is serving readers, and I definitely don't think this is serving authors anymore. And I think we started to see some of this conversation coming up, particularly around the Barnes & Noble hardcover sale, which I didn't shop this year, but that was logistics as much as anything. And we were seeing a lot of readers kind of like, well, why aren't we having a paperback sale? I'm a paperback reader. I would be much more likely to shop a paperback sale. And I've been out of the book selling business for a couple of years now, but I am going to make an educated anecdotal guess. And to be fair, all of these kind of ponderings are going to be anecdotal guesses or anecdotal observations. So feel free to chime in with your own anecdotal observations or ponderings, because they are going to be different from mine, just based on the fact that everyone's life experience is different. So we're not going to be coming things from exactly the same angle. But swinging back to the fact that I was a bookseller at one point, I am willing to bet that a lot of this hardcover sale goes back to kind of cutting losses and its excellent publicity in the mix. And what do I mean about cutting losses? Well, we are in this hardcover first kind of system where after 6 months to a year, a book will be released in paperback, which means that that hardcover has a kind of shelf life. It is only going to retain that value for so long. And after a certain point, it becomes stale stock for the store and a loss for both the store and the publisher in some ways. If you have done book hauls or bought books and you saw the little black dot at the bottom of the book, if you shopped the Barnes & Noble kind of bargain bin and seen the little dot there, though I believe they have changed some of their practices regarding their bargain section and things are being sourced particularly for the bargain rather than us seeing like remainders of the overbought James Patterson title end up there. But if these hardcovers are sticking around, at a certain point they are a loss. And even if the bookstore ships them back, I believe believe there are still costs associated with that. So they're not necessarily going to have to eat the entire cost if they've taken a chance on a book and it hasn't sold, but there still is a loss associated with that book sitting on the shelf. So by selling them at half off at the end of the year, even though at that point you are effectively selling those books at a loss, you are preventing the kind of legwork of having to send those out for remainders. You're making it so you don't have to send those books back in returns, which saves kind of manpower hours or workforce hours, or the actual technical term for that I am completely blanking on in this moment. And you're then making room for new stock. And especially how this sale is timed every year, or for the last 2 years they've done it right after Christmas, which makes sense as a consumer because it's this after the holidays kind of blowout sale. You've got gift cards to spend, you're excited, even if you're kind of like, oh, I just spent all this money on the holidays. However, from a kind of bookseller standpoint, it makes sense because one, you're getting your sales in at the end of the fiscal year. And don't ask me any questions on fiscal years. That's about the extent of my knowledge on fiscal years. But two, you are getting a lot of this stale stock out of the store right before inventory, or at least close to inventory, which usually happens in the first quarter of the next year. And having worked many in inventory, I fully support that goal. So we're seeing this idea that hardcovers don't have the same kind of longevity that paperbacks will. However, so much emphasis is put on hardcovers and hardcover success, because how that book performs in the first 6 months to a year, which is kind of the standard for a book to remain in hardcover, that kind of frontlist time period, is going to determine not only the life cycle of that book in some ways, and completely ignoring the fact that, especially with inflation and price creep, it is harder to take chances on the new and unknown. And sure, there are conversations to be had about the kind of discrepancy in pricing on places like Amazon especially, but as I mentioned before, Amazon is purposefully selling those books under list price as a loss leader to kind of get people in and kind of squash the competition. So if you're shopping other places, it's harder to take that chance on that unknown author. There's a reason I used to buy my Discover Bay authors at Barnes & Noble, one from the Discover New Writers Bay where they were usually 20% off. I would stack the membership on top of that and I would buy it with a coupon. I used to be a master of my Barnes & Noble membership coupons and I miss them. So what I'm really saying here is I think that the hardcover first model is outdated and I don't really understand publishing kind of clinging to it. I think we are starting to see more books come out in trade paperback first, especially in, well, genre fiction. It always has been. And by genre fiction, I mostly mean romance. Now we're seeing that kind of thing that we saw in the 2000s as well, where really popular romance authors will kind of move into a hardcover first model. We're seeing it with Emily Henry, and I think people were initially kind of shocked to see it going into hardcover after her other books have been in paperback, and it felt like a return to something for me, so I wasn't really that shocked by it. And I think that we are seeing more fantasy kind of toy with this idea of this paperback first model, which I think makes sense because both of these genres have very voracious readerships that go through a lot of titles. So it makes sense to make those titles more accessible to them. They can buy more books that way. They can read more books that way. They can discover more authors that way. And then you are supporting your authors, especially because as much as there is a lot of conversation and necessary conversation about all of the people we are not seeing represented, especially in traditional publishing right now, there are many, many voices that we still need represented and still need to hear from. But we also have what feels like, anecdotally again, a more saturated market than I remember when I was a teen. And granted, things have changed drastically since the kind of mid-2000s. The nature of book discovery is much different. I have more access to things, period. It's all different. But the TBR runs deep at this point, and so you have to make it easier for readers to engage with new authors, and part of that is making it more accessible for them. Now, I know that the payout on hardcovers is more, and that may be part of it. I never want to take dollars out of authors' pockets, so maybe publishers have run the numbers and realized that selling less hardcovers is more money than selling more paperbacks. I don't know. But it feels kind of weird to be locked in this system, especially when so much emphasis is placed on that kind of beginning period and the early life cycle of the book, which I will swing back to. But I do want to talk about book formats just a little bit longer because I will have a bee in my bonnet probably until I die in terms of how publishers drove up the prices of ebooks and how ebook pricing for frontlist titles just isn't competitive with the physical book in many cases at this point. Now, you can have a preference for digital and still pre-order it there, obviously, and there is still a benefit benefit to pre-ordering. We'll talk about pre-ordering too, don't you worry. But if I'm looking to buy a new book and I look up the ebook price and the physical book price, and there is only a couple dollars difference at most, of course, well, I mean, it's not an of course. My preference would be, I'll just buy the physical. And that was very purposeful from publishers. They have been scared of ebooks since they launched. Librarians, chime in below with the details of how much those Libby books cost for your library systems, because I know it is astronomical. And I know those loans are limited by either a time frame or a number of checkouts. And I know that the kind of early ebook pricing boom was unsustainable for authors and publishers. I get that. However, I don't think that there should be this wide of a discrepancy. Personally, I don't want to spend more than $10 on an ebook, and that's really pushing it. However, when ebooks are priced a little lower or they're on sale, I'm more likely to take a chance on an author or just pick something up because I had a passing interest in it. And even if I'm like, oh, well, I could get that from the library, then I have it for like $1 or $2 and I can read it whenever I feel like it. Now, that is also a problem because things will sit on my Kobo for 100 years, but nevertheless, I have it. And by having it, I've at least thrown some pennies at the author, but it feels, especially in terms of ebooks, like there was this really exciting development in the readership space. This was really revolutionary for a lot of people, and it's easy to kind of poo-poo how important this was for a lot of people. Keep in mind that ebooks allow people to change the size of their font, which is so incredibly important for people with vision issues, and especially for people who would probably predominantly read large print books. Now, is a $15 frontlist ebook still a pretty significant price drop from a large print book? Yes, but it still doesn't really feel fair to that readership. And in the case of ebook pricing, it feels like the publishers were only seeing the dollars they thought they were losing, rather than looking at all of the sales that were being made because of the way ebooks were being priced and how people were more likely to buy things, and that discovery was up because of it. So we have this kind of thriving ecosystem, and I'm not saying it's not still doing well, but there was a real boom. And I think that when we're talking about this kind of return to physical books, there's definitely the aesthetics angle, there's definitely the nostalgia angle, there's definitely the satisfaction of being able to see a book you love on your shelf, but it also feels like the most obvious way that publishing has kind of wrangled readers into how they want readers to behave, rather than kind of responding to what they are seeing readers doing and getting inventive and innovative. For instance, at this point, I don't read the same way I did at 16. I can't sit hunched over like a goblin on my bed for like 7 hours straight. Sometimes I like to switch between a physical book and an ebook, sometimes also between a physical book and an audiobook. And I know that this is another place where there's some kind of innovation from Amazon, and I don't like to give them too much credit, but the way that publishers haven't really picked up on this is baffling to me. If I have missed it, please let me know, because it feels like such an easy leap. But if you buy a book in one forum, offering other forms of it at a discounted rate, and then you're still more money in the pocket than you would have been before. Or if you want to be really generous, which I don't think they will be based on how they're pricing ebooks, offer a free ebook with a hardcover, especially with the price of hardcovers now, especially because this would offer opportunities to kind of compete with the Amazon market share. Now, I bet if publishers did this and didn't offer Amazon options, there would be lawsuits, just as there were shady tactics when publishers tried to push back and fight against the lowered pricing on Amazon for books, period. But if you gave people more options, there's always the potential that they would move away from that ecosystem as well. There's so much opportunity for innovation of form, and I feel like publishing is either doing like the stupidest thing you could think of, or not letting things live long enough to really get an accurate sense of the thing. Those two examples specifically are, do you remember those like Penguin Teen, I think specifically the John Green books that were supposed to like fit in your pocket, but you read them flipped up kind of long ways? I don't know what they were going for with that. Sure, it could fit in a pocket because at the time teens had pockets, and teens still have way more pocket than they had when I was a teen. However, it just didn't seem like it was serving an actual reader need, which I think is why it died out. However, a couple years ago, we talked briefly about Mass Max, which was a slightly larger mass market paperback that they were playing with. And I honestly kind of fell in love with Mass Max. They were slightly bigger, as you know, I just said, but that meant that they were a little bit floppier, and that meant that you were less likely to break the spine on them. Actually, hold on, I have examples. Okay, so here are two books that are still on my TBR. So here we have a kind of traditional Beverly Jenkins mass market. This is the format I was conditioned for as a romance reader growing up, and the form that we're largely seeing die out, which is making me incredibly sad. Though I think we're seeing mass market die across genres, because it was also very popular in fantasy and sci-fi, also cozy mystery mysteries. You know, I haven't had my eye on cozy mysteries recently, so let me know if you're a cozy mystery reader, if this is also impacting cozy mysteries. Because if there's one genre that might survive the mass market death, it might be cozy mysteries, but I feel like I've been seeing in my periphery even there a creep into trade paperback. However, there is then the Mass Max, in a series that will now spread across mass market and mass max because further books are being released in mass market instead of mass max. You know how it goes. So it's just a little floppier and it makes it easier to read without breaking the spine, which is all I've ever wanted out of life. I don't want to break my spine. You can see here that the type is just closer to that spine. It doesn't, you have to hold it, you have to kind of support the spine like a baby head. It just reads more comfortably. However, they apparently weren't seeing the sales of this, but they weren't looking at kind of extenuating circumstances surrounding. One, we were already seeing a creep into trade, especially with romance. I believe they started playing with the Mass Max format in like 2020, 2021, which should also be setting off alarm bells in your head, because what were we doing in 2020, 2021? Most of it did not involve going outside and going into bookstores. So people weren't organically coming across these books. They weren't organically realizing a difference in the format. They were just seeing the book be $1 more online and they weren't really recognizing why. Now we're seeing that price increase stay, but returning back to the mass market form. I will be interested though to see if we start creeping authors out of this. I've noticed Avon in particular, who is the romance house that a lot of my favorite authors are published by, starting to creep some of these authors into trade paperback. For instance, Cat Sebastian has moved from mass market paperbacks and now she's being published in trade paperback with cartoon covers. I do think some of that was to try and grab the red, white, and royal blue readership, but there are extra factors in the consideration of all of this, right? Nothing is mutually exclusive, nothing lives in a bubble. However, I don't think the Mass Max format was given enough air to breathe to really know if it was successful or not. So I feel like we have this kind of ecosystem where it's either like harebrained ideas or potentially good ideas that we scrap so early in the life cycle. And neither really feels like it's serving reader needs. Man, I was afraid I wasn't gonna have enough to say about this topic, but this has been percolating for a while. I've been itching to talk about this, I think. Let's stay on format for just a moment longer and kind of circle back to this idea of aesthetic. I know there have been a lot of internet debates recently, and I'm not gonna dive into this discourse, don't worry, about how readers are more interested in books as objects rather than whatever the contents of the book are, which I personally feel is a reductive sentiment. Because when you're in this ecosystem where there are options in terms of format, libraries exist, and the price of books has increased exponentially, then it makes sense that you want this book, which is an investment in some ways, to make you happy both for its contents and for how it looks in your space. And we've seen a rise in kind of book boxes that are fulfilling this need for people. And personally, I don't subscribe to any book boxes, and I know that it is very much a partnership between the box and the publisher, but I don't know to what extent, and it feels like kind of money left on the table for publishers. I think we're starting to see them creep into that space. I think we're seeing Barnes & Noble play with the ideas of special editions much more in a way that more closely aligns to the special editions at Waterstones, which is all I've ever wanted. Those special editions are gorgeous and aren't just a sticker that says like Barnes & Noble exclusive edition. But I think that there are opportunities for publishers there. Now, I know publishing is really thin on the ground right now, in terms that its workers are spread very thin. There have been lots of people that left over the course of the pandemic, and instead of replacing a lot of those jobs, people's workloads have just been increased. There has been an incredible amount of burnout. These are all parts of the conversation that were happening around the strike as well. So it may just be a workload issue, and it may be more worth it for them to kind of outsource that labor through book boxes and kind of just offer the licensing and then not have to worry about the production. It just feels like an opportunity. And in some ways, I think we're seeing publishers kind of wake up to this, especially in terms of kind of re-releasing new covers for incredibly popular series. And this brings us back to the kind of life cycle of the book and how I think that the current system isn't really serving books in the best possible way, and how it's forcing all of this pressure in this kind of like beginning period of a book. This idea that it has to kind of really take off when it's a frontlist title, which increases the pressure for ARC reading and all of that. But I am particularly annoyed by the emphasis on pre-orders, especially for new authors, because I think that there's too much emphasis put on pre-orders, especially considering places like Barnes & Noble, which regularly do pre-order sales. And I will admit, I do a lot of my pre-orders through them because of that. Frequently, if I pre-order a book and it comes out on Tuesday, I won't get it till the end of the week if I'm lucky. So if I'm genuinely excited about a title, what is the benefit for me as a reader if I'm pre-ordering? And don't say like you get a bookmark, which I'm not negating, I'm not poo-pooing. I know that authors especially put so much work into these pre-order campaigns because they are pressured with so much of the responsibility of the pre-order campaign. campaign. The life cycle of their book is largely determined by the pre-order campaign, which is especially unfair for debut authors because they don't have an existing readership. Maybe they have an existing following, which kind of pushes this narrative that you need a following to succeed as an author, which I don't think is true, but I think that we're caught up in this short fad life cycle that's kind of creeped into books. Books don't expire, and I think that actually TikTok has only proven that because the titles that are credited as the kind of quintessential book talk titles are largely books that were incredibly successful when initially released. Did TikTok drive them back into bestseller lists? Absolutely. There's no contesting that. But they were already incredibly successful titles. Or even if it's picked up and popularized things that were more mid-list the first time around, or flew under the radar the first time around, fact remains that these books haven't expired. And while I understand the kind of business side of things in terms of this pressure for success early on for an author, that idea that you need to be able to prove further sales, it also chafes against my artistic instincts, and it also still feels rooted in the way that I often view publishers as responding rather than innovating, but responding poorly often. And maybe they think that efforts to kind of pigeonhole readers into how they want readers to behave in terms of how we interact with books, how we discover books, how we buy books is innovation. I would argue that it's still responsive, but responsive to a market that has drastically changed, and you're still trying to respond to the way it used to be. And that doesn't serve authors new or old in a climate where they need supported and served more than ever, nor does it serve readers who are looking for exciting new stories, looking to support exciting new voices, to discover new worlds and authors and ways of thinking. Rather, it often feels like we're being pushed back into kind of a stagnant way of looking at things and thinking about things. Nor do I think it's fair, and honestly I think it's lazy to put so much reliance on an author's existing followers and kind of following in relation to marketing their books rather than actually marketing their books. Mid-list titles right now are being incredibly underserved, and that is heartbreaking. And I think that a lot of these systems in place, if they were adapted and changed, would better serve these mid-list titles. But I think this emphasis on the front list has also creeped into things like discovery in stores. We're seeing this creep into things like the purchasing decisions at Barnes & Noble. So it becomes harder and harder to kind of discover a new book organically, to discover new authors organically. So then they don't perform as well, and then publishers drop them based on that performance when they haven't offered the support. And there are so many incredible gems and voices hidden in the mid-list based purely on what publishers think is marketable. And to a certain extent, I get it. It is your job to sell books, but make that easier for yourself by listening to your consumers, to your audience. So I don't know. I think those are kind of my broad swath biggest annoyances right now. If you have more, please let me know. I'm sure I'll think of more at some point. So maybe there's more diatribe to come as I kind of ponder this more, as we converse about this more. But I would be really, really interested to hear what you're thinking about all of this. If you think you're being served as a reader right now or not, how and why, etc., etc. So thanks for hanging out and listening to my thoughts here. Read something good, like and subscribe if you feel like it, and yeah,